Hey everyone, very quickly before we get into the video, the YouTube channel recently reached 10,000 subscribers, and to celebrate that, I'm going to be doing a Q&A next week. Now, in order to gather all of the questions, I set up a channel in my Discord channel specifically for this. If you've ever wanted to ask me a question, can be about anything, then head over to the link in the description towards my Discord channel, and then you can go and ask your question there. Now, back to the video. Hey everyone, this is Mike. Today I'm going to be doing my first impressions for the Genshin Impact Open Beta. Now, if you've never heard of this game, it is coming out in about 2 weeks time. That is when the game will officially release. But yesterday, the open beta for the Chinese server went live, and I basically wanted to hop in and try it out. Now, if you want to try it out for yourself a little bit early, you do need to create a Chinese account, link all of that stuff, which is a little bit of a hassle, but if you want to try it out, you don't need a VPN or anything like that. So you can basically just look up a guide on YouTube. There's a couple ones out there. They're pretty easy to follow. Now, if you've never heard of the game before, it is basically anime Breath of the Wild with gacha elements. It is a single player roleplay game which is very much open world, but there is also a gacha system involved. It's a free-to-play game, so I would imagine that the gacha system is pretty much how they are going to be making their money to keep the game up to date. Now, of course, if you know gacha games, you probably know that they are very much so a money sink, so I can see why people would have some concerns. Now, when it comes down to playing the game, when it comes down to requiring certain characters, I've always found that every time I go into a dungeon, which are called domains in this game, but I'm just gonna refer to them as dungeons for the sake of this video, then every time you needed a specific character, the game would just give them to you, because certain dungeons require you to have specific types of characters in your party. For example, you need a fire character to shoot down wooden barricades, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to go through there, or you need an ice character in order to traverse water or something like that. You can just like freeze the water so that you don't stand into the spikes that's underneath there, or you can freeze fire traps for a short duration so that you don't have to run through them and take a bunch of damage. So of course, every time you go into a dungeon, the party layout, I guess you could say, because when you go into a dungeon, there is a party setup that you can choose, where you can pick and choose your characters that you want to take into the dungeon. It also gives you a recommendation of what characters you should be bringing, and if you don't have those characters in your party, then they will just give you a trial character for you to take with you, so that you can still make it through the dungeon. So I don't necessarily think that the gacha is going to be there like you need specific gacha characters in order to make it through this game, because of course it is still a single player RPG. There is no real competitiveness. Yes, there is co-op, but there's no real PvP or anything like that that I know of. So I don't really think that the gacha is really there for you to be like, I need these characters in order to play specific content. I think it's more gonna be like, oh, I like this gacha character, I like the skills, I like the way they look or something like that, and then basically gacha for them to try and get them. Of course, it is an open beta. I didn't get to spend any money on the game, which I'm also not planning to do, because I would like to stay free to play in this game, but of course it is something that we could see change in the future, depending on how the gacha is actually going to be influencing this game. So it is something that I can't really comment on too much, because it was a non-factor at least this early into the game. If you're wondering, I played about 5-6 hours of the game so far. Now, when it comes down to my first impressions, they were actually horrible when I first started playing the game, and I'll explain why. Now, when it comes down to the things that I found bad about this game, there were 3 different points, which I'll talk about in just a second. But so far, after these 6 hours of playing, only one really remained, which I would like to see changed. But even so, I kind of got used to this little bit of a downside to the game as I played through it a little bit more. So the 3 things that I found really annoying were, first of all, the combat, but this turned a complete 180 when I played a little bit more. Disconnects, or the game crashing, and the camera. The camera is freaking horrible in this game, but I'll talk about it in just a second. So when it comes down to the combat, let's talk about that one first, because that is probably a pretty important point for a lot of different players. Now, when it comes down to this game, you control a party of 4 different characters, and each character has, of course, their own set of basic attacks, their own set of an alternative attack, a skill that they can use, and also a ultimate move, I guess we'll call it for now. Now, of course, the ultimate is something that takes a very long time to charge up, and is something that you don't get to use every battle. Maybe if you're playing through a dungeon, for example, it's something that you'll be able to have charged up by the time that you reach the final boss, but it's not something that you'll be able to use frequently at all. Now, the reason why I thought the combat was really bad at the beginning is because it felt pretty empty. You play with that one character and you only have like that basic attack that you're basically going to be spamming for the most part. Yes, it has an alternative version, but still it doesn't really add all that much depth to the combat. And then you have that one skill that you'll be able to use like once every 10 seconds, something along those lines. And it didn't really feel all that interesting to me. Even for a hack and slash game, it didn't really feel that good. But that was also because I was playing the game completely wrong. You have these 4 different characters in your party and you are supposed to use all 4 as well, because all of these different elements, because of course, which is often the case in gacha games, each character has their own element that they are kind of like in tune with. And depending on what element you are using, you're also able to give enemies specific elemental debuffs. And a lot of the different characters will play off of these debuffs. So for example, say you're playing against enemies that are standing in water. I can use an ice character, I believe it's called Frost in this game. And when I use their attacks, I can actually freeze these enemies in place so that they can't attack me back and maybe weaken them in the process as well. Or I can, for example, use my Electro Mage, which is like electricity, to give them a shock effect so that they are constantly getting shocked whilst they are standing in this water. Not only that, but if there, for example, is no water around, I can use a water character in order to give them that wet debuff and then play around with it like that. I can also, for example, use my Frost Mage to give enemies the frost debuff, which might not necessarily freeze them in place because they didn't have water attached to them. But then if they have the frost debuff and I use my Electro Mage, then I can give them the overload status, which then does a bunch of damage to them as well. So basically all of the different elemental characters are going to be playing off of each other, and the game doesn't really incentivize you to play one character and one character only. No, you're basically going to be incentivized to switch in between your 4 characters in your party quite regularly to play off of different combos that your characters are going to be doing. And these can be both offensive as well as defensive. For example, as I said, you apply water to someone, then switch to your Ice Mage to then freeze them. You could, for example, also give them the electrical debuff, switch to an Earth character to then give yourself a shield or something like that. There's basically a couple of different variants in what these electrical combos will be doing for you, and getting through the fight is going to be a lot easier if you're using these combos effectively. And once I found out about this combo system, that is where the combat actually took a complete 180 for me, and I actually started to get really interested in trying out all of these different combos that the different characters had available for me. So that's actually where I think that the combat is actually pretty fun. Even though I kind of hated it at the start because it felt empty, it kind of made a complete 180 and is actually a very interesting combat system. So on to number 2, the disconnects, which is something that I have basically experienced throughout my whole time of playing the game. When I first launched it yesterday, when I was just playing it a little bit to get into it, I had frequent disconnects during the stream that I did last night as well. I streamed for about 3.5 hours, or maybe it's like more like 3 hours, doesn't matter. I had quite frequent disconnects as well, and then this morning when I was recording the gameplay that you are seeing, I tried my best to edit all of them out, but I disconnected like 3 or 4 times in the span of an hour of trying to record gameplay. So there are a lot of frequent disconnects, or just like quite literally the game disappearing on me, just complete crashing, which could be up to the fact that I'm playing on a Chinese server, so who knows, because I'm playing with like 250 ping, it could be that I get disconnected from the server and that might just immediately close the game, something like that. I did notice that every time I loaded into a new instance, like for example going through a door with the loading screen, those would be the points as to where the game would crash, not just necessarily running around in the open world and all of a sudden the game is gone. So I'm not quite sure if it has anything to do with just the game being stable as it is being ran, or if it was an issue with me connecting to a Chinese server from Europe. So that might also be one of the reasons why the game was quite unstable. So that is also one of the reasons why I decided to not include this as one of the problems that I had with the game, because that could just be, it is still open beta, they're trying to stress test their servers, and maybe me connecting from so far away, 250 ping around that, could be the reason why the game would frequently crash on me. And then last but not least, the one complaint that is going to stick with me for now are the camera controls. I played the game with both keyboard and mouse as well as with a controller being my preferred method to play this game, and it felt kind of bad because the way the camera works in this game is you cannot change the sensitivity of everything. Like basically if you change your sensitivity, it will change both the horizontal as well as the vertical sensitivity. It's kind of like locked together under one sensitivity like bar, I guess we could say. Now the problem here is that the sensitivity for your horizontal like movement as well as your vertical movement is different. Now, I'm somebody that's played a lot of shooter games in the past, and even when it comes down to just more of these single-player RPGs where you're playing in a third-person mode, I've played a fair amount of these games, and when it comes down to my horizontal sensitivity being different from my vertical sensitivity, it kind of feels awkward, and it's not like there is a small difference in between them. There's actually a very big difference where I would be spinning 360s if I barely touched my mouse, but then if I want to try to look up and down, my camera is barely moving even though I am making very big movements with my mouse, or for example with my joystick. So that is definitely something that I think is an issue, especially because of the fact that there is a lot of verticality in this game, like where you have to move up cliffs or for example jump down cliffs, and it's not easy to just immediately look down because it's a lot harder to move your camera up and down than it is to move your camera left and right. So that is definitely a very big complaint for me, and something that I found to be very intrusive as well. It's for example in the dungeon gameplay that I'm showing as well at the start, where I'm flying quite a bit because this was kind of an introduction to like airborne gameplay where you can fly around, drop bombs and all of that kind of stuff. It felt very annoying not really being able to see where I was flying towards, because it was just very different or just very difficult for me to move my camera upwards. So that is definitely one of the biggest complaints that I have had with this game so far. Now, of course, it is a single player game, it is a very story driven game, so let's talk about that real quick as well, because of course it is a Asian game and it has Chinese, it has Japanese, it also has English voice acting, and it has another one, but I forgot which one the fourth one was. I played the first half of the game in English, I played the second half of the game in Japanese, because of course it is an anime, so you wanted to kind of see, or like an anime style game, so I kind of wanted to see what the Japanese voice acting was like, which was pretty good, but surprisingly enough the English voice acting was also very good for the game. So if you're somebody that would rather just listen to the characters talk rather than to read through all of the dialogue, because there's a lot of story in this game, pretty much everything is voice acted as well. I think I've only had one side quest so far in about 6 hours of playtime where there was no voice acting. So pretty much everything is voice acted in this game for the most part. I'd say like 90% or anything like that, which is quite positive in my opinion, because I do like voice acted stuff in my games, and the English voice acting being good is another bonus to that. So yes, the Japanese voice acting was a little bit better in my opinion, but I'm also kind of used to like watching anime back in the day, so looking at an anime style game, hearing Japanese voices kind of matches in my head. But I have to say that the English voice acting definitely wasn't all that bad. Now, let's get into the last point before I kind of wrap it up, and that is moving around the map. Because of course, this is an open world game. You can choose to follow your main quest line, you can go on an adventure, to go into specific dungeons or domains as they're called over here, once you've got a specific level for that. But basically, moving around the map is something that is very important, and I have to say that there is a positive and a negative to it. So the positive is that there are a lot of teleporting beacons scattered around the map that once you kind of like interact with them, you can teleport to them from anywhere free of charge. If you're in a dungeon, you of course can't teleport anywhere, but say for example you're out somewhere in the wilds in the middle of nowhere, you need to go back to the main city for your story, you can just teleport over. Doesn't cost you anything in order to do so. Very good system indeed. Now when it comes down to just moving around the map, that is where it starts to get a little bit more annoying, because you have a stamina system, and the main thing that's good about the stamina system is that it is used for things like rock climbing, gliding downwards, because you can like jump from rocks and then you can glide downwards with your glider, and then you also need stamina in order to swim. The problem is that you also need stamina in order to run, and this made it so that if you're trying to get from point A to point B on foot, you would be walking a little bit, running for a small portion of time, walking again, running again, and that kind of felt annoying. I'd rather just be able to run at one point and then just like stop running once I get there. Like, I can kind of get why there is a stamina system, because you also need it for all of these other things that I just listed, and then of course it makes it so that you can't just run circles when you're in battle. But when you're outside of battle, I do feel like just being able to run constantly would feel a whole lot better. Or maybe, who knows, at some point in the game they give you a mount that you can mount up and just ride around. Then that would basically fix that issue for me as well. Now, last but not least, let's talk about leveling, because of course this is a gacha game. You are gachaing for different characters, and if for example you are at max level, which I believe is level 80, although I'm not 100% sure on that, that is some gameplay that I saw way back in the day. But basically, let's say you're at max level, let's say level 80 is the max just for the sake of it, and you get a new gacha character, and you want to use this new gacha character in your max level team to go into a dungeon. something like that. Then basically there are books that you can acquire that you can use to boost the experience or to boost the levels that one of your characters has. So that is a way for you to level your characters very quickly if you get some new ones through, for example, the story, because of course the story also gives you some characters. There is a way to obtain characters through questing as well, which I'm not going to go into in this video because I personally did not get a high enough level in order to get that, which I'll talk about now. So basically your characters have their own levels, but you, the player, you as the account, also have a level which is called the adventurer level, and you'll basically have to do a bunch of different things like questing, beating field mobs, going into domains, clearing those domains, finding different collectibles out in the open world as well, in order to increase your adventurer rank. And a lot of different things like going into specific domains, being able to accept certain quests, are going to be locked behind having a specific adventurer rank. So that's kind of how they handle the whole leveling system in this game. You're not necessarily going to be locked behind the level of your characters, instead you are locked behind the level of your account, I guess we'll call it, your adventurer rank. So overall, I do really think that this is a pretty good game. I'm gonna kind of ignore the crashes that I have had so far because they might have been caused because of the latency between me and the Chinese server, because as I mentioned, I played with about 200-250 ping, so that could be one of the reasons why I crashed so frequently. Combat felt pretty bare bones when I started out, but actually started to become something that I really enjoyed as I played the game a little bit more. As I mentioned, I played for about 6 hours, so the combat actually started to get pretty interesting with all of the different combinations. Of course, camera controls, don't like them. I really hope they're gonna change that going into the full release, because otherwise that is going to be something that I'm gonna be feeling like is a downside for this game when I do my review of the game once it does finally come out and I'm able to put in a decent amount of time into it. The story of the game feels pretty fine. Gacha, I can't really talk about that just yet, because purely I just don't really know anything about it, how much gacha currency we're going to be able to get through just playing the game, how much the gacha is going to cost when it comes down to real money, if that is the way that they decide to monetize this game. Of course, when it comes down to leveling, adventure rank I think is a pretty good way to handle all of that stuff, because of course you are going to be playing with different characters, and overall first impressions were pretty good. So outside of literally just not really knowing how the monetization for the gacha system is going to be and not knowing if the camera system is going to be changed, those would be the two unknowns right there, with the camera system being the one downside really to the game, whereas the rest I think is all quite alright. So that's gonna be it for me. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of this game, if you've had a chance to play in the open beta, or if you are looking forward to the game. From all of the little trailers that they have been releasing over the last few days, new characters, specific stories, all of that good stuff. But I want to thank you for watching, I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.